Australian journalist Jonathan Swan, a White House reporter for the New York Times, is perhaps best known for his hard-hitting interviews with Donald Trump. Most famous, of course, was his August 2020 exchange with Trump, in which Swan's incredulous facial expressions, while listening to the muddled assertions of the president, earned the then 35-year-old reporter an Emmy Award. Now, Swan has teamed up with fellow Times reporter and Trump expert Maggie Haberman to write Regime Change, inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump, a withering behind-the-scenes look at how Trump has consolidated executive power in his second term, stripping away institutional checks and balances, bullying the media, and padding the bank accounts of his family. I'm Conrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, featuring weekly in-depth conversations with fascinating people. In this episode, Jonathan Swan, who is the son of ABC broadcaster Dr Norman Swan, discusses his early years as a reporter with the Sydney Morning Herald, his fascination with US politics, what it's like being face-to-face with Trump, the risk of retribution by the president and his rusted-on supporters, and much more. This episode is hosted by Good Weekend senior writer Greg Callaghan.
Thank you, Conrad, and welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks so much for having me.
Congratulations on Regime Change. I'm told by your publisher, Simon & Schuster in Sydney, that it's already had 4 reprints in Australia and is on the way to being the highest-selling non-fiction title of 2026 in Australia. I presume it's doing just as well overseas. You must be absolutely thrilled.
Yeah, it's been beyond anything we had hoped for. Completely crazy, actually, over here in particular. Yeah.
Now, have you had much sort of pushback, any blowback from Trump himself or the Trump administration, or even from some of his more ardent supporters?
Yeah, I mean, President Trump has posted about us, said Maggie Haberman and her flunky Jonathan Swan, and he called me a lightweight, and said it's boring and it's fake and whatever. We've actually had no denials of anything of substance from anyone in any of these scenes that we've published, and a lot of it's been out there for quite a while. I mean, we put a lot of this in the New York Times before the book published in terms of like some of the really key scenes in the lead up to the Iran war, and nobody's disputed any of it. So maybe they will at some point if he forces someone to dispute something. But Trump has been obviously very unhappy, but we haven't heard any denials of any of the substance of the book.
Now, your book covers the first year of Trump's second presidency. We saw Trump's playbook during his first term. It reached its chaotic, destructive conclusion with the attempted insurrection on January 6. But as you show in your book so tellingly, he used the 4 years of the Biden administration, 4 years of legal troubles and media exile to benefit himself very well in the longer term, didn't he?
He really did. Look, whatever you think about Donald Trump, he's an extraordinarily resilient figure, and he has shown a regenerative capacity that I think almost no one anticipated. Certainly none of his inner circle when he left office could have imagined that he returned to power, but he imagined it. He refused to accept that he'd lost the 2020 election. And one thing I always say about Trump, and you'll hear it from people who spend a lot of time around him, is you inhabit his reality. He creates his own reality, and it's pretty much sealed off from intrusions of fact or anything to kind of counter that reality. You basically have to make a decision: do I want to live inside this bubble or not? And he created this bubble in which he was the rightful president, in which he'd never lost the election, that it was stolen from him. Of course, no evidence of that, and that it was inevitable that he would come back because he was so beloved. And it was through this extraordinary act of will, and then his opponents gave him so many gifts throughout that period, including, as it turns out, all these attempts to prosecute him, which is I'm not making any judgment about the validity or not of the legal cases, but the political effect is indisputable.
Indeed. But if anything, Trump's become more bullying and more adept at using his billionaire loyalists to buy up and control the media. It's pretty alarming.
Well, I'm lucky to work for a publication, the New York Times, where he has no leverage over the New York Times. We don't depend on Trump's approval for any kind of deal that the owners are trying to pull off. We don't need licenses from the government. We have a family that's been devoted to the paper for, more than a century. And thank goodness the New York Times has been financially successful, because we sure as hell need it. We're being sued by the president, on many fronts, and efforts to investigate our reporters. Several of my colleagues had the FBI show up at their doorstep recently for, what was pretty standard public interest reporting about Air Force One. So if it wasn't for the infrastructure of the New York Times and the solidity of the New York Times, we wouldn't be in as good a position journalistically at all.
He often uses, of course, derogatory language to insult journalists. He's used a derogatory nickname, maggot, to attack your highly respected co-author, Maggie Haberman. He's told a woman reporter aboard Air Force One to be quiet piggy. He's accused the ABC reporter John Lyons of hurting Australia. From the anecdotes in your book, it reads like he can be charming to your face. The stories you provide of those meetings with Joe Biden after Trump won the second time, and how charming he was to Joe Biden, and yet within days or weeks he was launching this tirade of really cruel insults. Is that who he is?
Yeah, that's absolutely who he is. We had a personal experience of it, which you can, you see in the book, which is, 3 days before we were scheduled to have an interview with President Trump. This is at the end of our book reporting, fact-checking interview that we'd been trying to get for months. He launched a very personal attack at my co-author, threatened to sue us, to add us to the lawsuit, very aggressive Truth Social post. And we walk into the Oval Office 3 days later and he's all smiles. How you doing? Do you want a Diet Coke? We completely anticipated that. He doesn't like, he's not very good at interpersonal conflict. He really avoids it. What I mean by interpersonal is right in front of him. Sometimes he does it. You'll see it in the press scrums, usually when he has a rolling heavy, when he has a big group behind him and there's a big pack. But when it's in a smaller setting, he doesn't really do it that much. So that's the way he is. I've heard others describe him as a day trader in the way he operates. He just does or says what he needs to do to get through the hour, to get through the interaction, to say whatever he thinks is needed to be said, to win that particular moment. So it didn't surprise anyone that he behaved that way with Joe Biden, but it also didn't mean anything. You often encounter people who go and see President Trump and they come away and say, wow, he's such a different person. So, which is, of course, is his intended effect. But he's not a different person. He's just doing what he needs to do in that moment, to make the sale, to make the performance. One thing that we tried to show in the book, which I think people don't fully grasp yet, and it helps explain why this term is so different from the last term, is his team around him are much more sophisticated at understanding government than they were in the first term, and much more interested in executing on his behalf. And that's, I think, a big part of why he's been able to get so much more of what he wants done this term. It's not some huge growth in Donald Trump's understanding of government or anything like that. It's an emboldened Trump, a more confident Trump, a more powerful Trump, but with a team around him that's able to execute on that.
You provide a very, very powerful account in the book of that heated scene in the Oval Office last year when Trump told Zelensky he doesn't hold the cards. Vance accused him of Zelensky, that is, of ingratitude, and a conservative reporter criticised Zelensky's dress. "I'm not playing cards," said Zelensky. So when you read all that background to that episode, the Trump administration's treatment of Zelensky was even more appalling because you understand how, in a way, he was set up.
The interesting thing about that incident was it was not orchestrated. They didn't plan this moment or this ambush, but it was also inevitable. I mean, one thing we show in the book early on is just how much contempt Trump had for Zelensky when he came back into office. We have some reporting in the book early on where we have Trump's first phone call with Vladimir Putin last year. It's actually the first time he talked to Putin since the first term. And straight after it, he calls Zelensky. And it's a very interesting moment because it's a study in contrasts. The call with Putin is chummy. Essentially, Trump is hoping that they can get past any kind of, issues with Russia and Ukraine and get straight into doing business deals between the US and Russia. And then he gets on with Zelensky and makes clear that just what you saw play out in that scene. Zelensky doesn't have any cards. You need to give up your country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Trump has, I would say broadly speaking, this applies to Australia, it applies to the UK, it applies to all kinds of small and middle powers. If you don't have a mighty military and a mighty economy, if you don't have real leverage that you can bring to bear against the United States, he has a sort of contempt for you, or at the very least, he expects you to behave in a certain way, which is completely sycophantic. And if you don't do that, then you could be punished in all kinds of ways. So one thing I often think about, when I talk to Australians is, some Australians are very engaged in America and American politics. Some just kind of tune it out or sort of, oh yeah, Trump, it's a circus. I don't really want to think about this or what have you. But the reality is, and this is what we tried to do in the book, is Australians don't really have the luxury of ignoring America. At a very fundamental level, Australia's security depends on America. And so understanding what's happening to the United States, understanding how all of this works and how it's evolving is of really vital interest to Australia.
Absolutely, and it's something that that's certainly being discussed in the press and by this paper and by Peter Harcher. But in terms of the social conversation, you're absolutely right. It isn't being fully appreciated. You describe in the book that European ambassadors, after that episode in the Oval Office, saw the meeting as a turning point that cemented a profound loss of trust in America. Do you think that Americans appreciate how much America's image of the world has been tarnished by Trump?
I think a lot of Americans don't appreciate that and haven't needed to appreciate that. When you are a resident or a citizen of a superpower, of the superpower, it naturally breeds complacency. And, I find when I travel, particularly to smaller countries, they're much more outward looking, much more interested in what's going on in other countries. When, that's less the case, I find. I'm generalizing here in ways that it's probably a bit overly broad, but generally I think it's the case here. Obviously, there are people who understand what's going on, but I don't think they realize how profound it is. Trump in the first term shook the Europeans. They were shaken by this experience of him questioning the NATO security alliance and whether America would actually come to help them if they were under attack. Now, I don't think anyone has any illusions left. So what are the long-term consequences of that? I actually don't know, because they don't really have good alternative options. What we're seeing is the Europeans are having a conversation now about how much can we become self-reliant, how much can we operate as a bloc, to what extent can we defend ourselves. This is not something that can be done very quickly. They're so integrated with the United States military, and they can't exactly just say, oh, great, China's a great option that we could just switch to, So Trump is basically, I remember having a conversation with someone in term one. This is someone who was a senior Obama administration official. And they described this process of what Trump is doing, of I can't remember the exact term. It was like a finance term that they were using. But basically they were saying that all of these relationships that America has around the world, there's a margin built into them, a margin of basically goodwill, because America has been very generous for the last 70, 80 years. It has, really, the Europeans have not defended built up their militaries. They've really rested on the American security guarantee. And Trump was easing into that margin. He was basically going around and squeezing every country, right? And this person said to me, you can do that circuit a couple of times. You can squeeze every country, get a little bit of a better trade deal, do this, do that. But every country has a point at which you've been squeezed too much. And you sort of say, F you, basically. And we're at that point now almost with the Europeans, certainly with the Canadians. I mean, you saw that, very extraordinary speech by Mark Carney. I don't know about the Australians. It certainly doesn't appear to me that they're willing to, Albanese is ready to say anything like that. But if you talk privately to people in Europe, people who would normally be considered some of America's staunchest allies, they absolutely do not consider the Americans to be a reliable ally anymore.
How on earth do countries try and connect with America when from one day to the other, it's depending on which way the wind blows?
The great lesson of this term is that there is no slick playbook for Trump. There are all these kind of consultants and people who charge lots of money for, I can be a Trump whisperer. I can tell you, here's the right combination of flattery and this and that. What does it get you? It might get you something very, very short term, and maybe you need something very short term. That's fine. So you get the short term thing. But it's not like he's storing it up as a bank. It's not like you're like making a deposit. You do all these lovely things for Mr. Trump, and then he'll remember that and he'll reward you down the track. It's not really how it works. His memory it's very short. And so if you've put a lot of money in the bank, if you've done all kinds of things, but then you say one thing that he doesn't like or you do one thing that he doesn't like, forget it. I mean, you saw that with the UK pretty recently. Everyone was, all the smarty pants sort of analysts were like, oh, Keir Starmer is so masterful at playing Donald Trump. He brought him the embossed card from, the king and blah, 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 blah. What did he get out of that? I mean, at the end of the day, the relationship was as bad as it could be. I mean, he was trashing him publicly. He essentially announced he was leaving before he had a chance to do it properly himself. So the way to deal with Trump is actually very difficult. You need to have real leverage. You can't fake it. The only people who've dealt successfully with him are people who have real leverage. Xi Jinping would be the most successful leader dealing with Trump this term. But guess what? Not every country has the power of the Chinese economy and the rare earth issue. Trump really took it to him on trade, and Xi Jinping was very well prepared. He had all of his tools ready to go. And in the end, Trump backed down and has been in a very dovish posture with China ever since. He respects strength. But so what do you do if you're a small power or a middle power? The only way to do it is collectively. So it's a collective action problem. And that's what we're seeing in Europe right now. And the UK is, it's kind of amazing. The only way the UK is ever going to deal with the US with any kind of leverage is with Europe attached to them. But of course, they've pulled themselves out. So I think it's a very, very difficult situation. I think that's why you're seeing so many countries have these quiet conversations about new blocks and ways to counterbalance the United States.
One of the most revealing things in your book, among so many, is that the half a dozen people who seem to be running the US. Can you run through the people, and can you also tell us who Natalie Harp is?
Yeah, so the core group that's making the big decisions are Vice President Vance, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State National Security Advisor, Susie Wiles, Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, who's probably the most powerful domestic policy staffer in the recent history of the White House. And then you've got the sort of deal makers, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, John Ratcliffe at the CIA. And on economic issues, Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary. But he also has, you just mentioned Natalie Harp. Trump's circle has always been populated by sycophants, but we're on a completely different level now. Natalie Harp's a figure that we focused on a little bit in the book because I think she represents the change in Trump's inner circle from the first term to the second term. So she was a TV host for a far-right network called OAN in America in the first term. And she was very devoted to Donald Trump. And she went and worked for him when he left office. And Maggie and I started hearing about her in 2022. We were hearing that the staff would call her the human printer. She would follow Trump around on the golf course with a portable printer, and she would print out positive stories to pep him up. You know, if he was in a bad mood, she would show him a story saying how great he was. And then we started to hear that the Secret Service and others around Trump were starting to become somewhat alarmed by her behavior. And we heard that she had been writing him letters. So, of course, we wanted to know what these letters were. Eventually, we got hold of the content of a number of these letters. And, you know, it contains phrases like, "You are all that matters to me. I wish we didn't have to talk about work all day. I want to basically just complete devotion to Trump." And you could see, these letters were being found in some of his private spaces and some of his private clubs. And it was of concern to both the Secret Service and people around Trump. But the person who it wasn't of concern to was Donald Trump. He very much enjoyed the flattery and the devotion. And he would say things in front of the rest of the staff like, "Natalie's the only one who loves me. You're all going to leave me and make money. She's always going to be with me." So anyway, she has transitioned from the campaign into government. And you'll see her, if you see photos in the Oval Office, you'll often see her off to the side. She basically has a permanent seat in every meeting that Trump's in. Doesn't matter if it's who it's with. Seat against the wall in the Oval with her laptop open. And she's this both a distributor and a conduit for Trump. He'll ask her to look things up for him, information. If he's not getting the information he wants to hear, she'll find him some alternative facts. But probably more consequentially, she's also a conduit for people who want to get information to Trump but don't want to go through the vetting process, the paper vetting process of any normal White House. They don't want it to be looked at by the staff secretary who goes through the legal vetting of documents. They don't want it going through the chief of staff. So Natalie Harp becomes a direct conduit to Donald Trump for all of these people. So, as crazy as it sounds, she's one of the most powerful people in the world, actually, because she is one of the primary informers, information sources of the President of the United States, and also a major distributor of his messages.
Let's go to April 2, 2025, Trump's Liberation Day. The backstory to his introduction of global tariffs is quite extraordinary in the book.
Look, Trump has had this idea of wanting to do tariffs for decades. He's been talking about how America's been ripped off. It used to be, you talk about Japan, it goes on and on and on. But in term one, he had advisors around him, people who had a lot of economic experience who were pushing back very hard and saying, look, if you do a broad tariff regime, this could cause huge problems in the economy, big disruption, don't do it. And there were real arguments in the Oval Office in the first term. This time around, Trump was determined to try out his theory. And it was one of the most thinly conceived ideas we've ever seen, particularly something of this scale. It looked chaotic just publicly, but the private planning was even more chaotic, as you'll see in the book. They didn't come up with the formula. They didn't agree on the formula, decide on the formula for these tariffs until the night before Trump. So everyone remembers, I'm sure, because it had such profound global effects. Trump's in the Rose Garden of the White House with the big whiteboards. Here's all the tariff rates. Everyone's going crazy because every country's trying to figure out, well, what's our tariff rate? How much is it going to hurt our economy? There was the stories about tariffing penguins. All of that was decided the night before. And so they mock up these boards and get them ready. It was a very scary moment for many people at the senior levels of the administration because Trump was dug in. And in the first term, he was much more reactive to movements in the stock markets or domestic political gyrations. This time around, he seemed willing to push his idea of tariffs right to the edge. And it took, as we document in the book, it took two of his most senior economic officials all but pleading with him to back off. And he still kept going. And ultimately, it was only because all the signs were indicating that the bond markets were about to melt down, which could have set off all kinds of economic calamity, global economic calamity, that Trump pulled back from the brink.
I have to ask you, has American politics always been your obsession? You grew up in Sydney. Your dad's a very well-known ABC broadcaster, Dr Norman Swan, highly respected. You worked in the press gallery for the Sydney Morning Herald. What spurred you to go to the US and work for Axios?
Well, I was very interested in American politics. I studied American history at university, but the way it all came together was a little bit of happenstance. I applied for I was in Canberra in the press gallery. I applied for a fellowship in early 2014, which was the American Political Science Association congressional fellowship. Basically, it allows you to spend a year in Washington learning about Congress. You have a small stipend, and then the idea is you go back to Australia and you're better informed about America. But the minute I got to Washington, sort of in my head, I was like, I was 29, I was not married, and I sort of thought to myself, I want to stay. I want to see if I can break in over here. And of course, I had a problem because I didn't have a visa. I didn't know anyone. And so while I was doing the fellowship, I was basically cold emailing everyone in Washington journalism, any editor who might meet with me or hire me. Understandably, no one wanted to hire me. And I was actually getting towards the end of the year. My visa was about to run out, and I had 2 job offers come in for small publications. And the one I took was actually a small publication called The Hill, sort of an insider beltway type publication, but it was to cover the 2016 campaign. And, that's all I needed. I just needed the job and the visa, and then you can just work harder than anyone else. And so that was my first one. And then after that campaign, quite a few people were offering me jobs, and Axios didn't even exist. I actually joined Axios before they announced the name as it was being founded. I didn't know anything about it besides that I knew everything I needed to know about it, which was that Jim Vanderhyde and Mike Allen, who are legendary in American media, they founded Politico. They were starting a new company, and to be able to get in with them at the ground floor was all I needed to know. And, had a very interesting 6 years there. And now I'm at the New York Times.
One of the depressing things from reading your book, is that there doesn't appear to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, a real possibility of correction. That is a restoration of America's systems of checks and balances post-Trump. What do you see? I'm not asking you to predict the future, but what's your feeling about the post-Trump America? Do you think that the America that we knew, the America I grew up with, the America we respected, do you think there's any hope of that coming back?
It's not impossible. America has had corrections before. The one I'm thinking of, which is probably most apt, is after Nixon. And you actually had a book written that it's 1973 called The Imperial Presidency. And of course, there was the Watergate scandal, Vietnam, a lot of unrest in American streets. And there was a period after Watergate with Jimmy Carter where there were reforms put in and Congress reasserted itself. Much more difficult for that to happen these days. The country is far more polarized. Our politics are far more polarized here. The media environment is so much more toxic. It's very hard to have any kind of a national conversation when, I'm sure there's a version of this in Australia, just not as extreme. Information is sliced up so thinly, no one's receiving the same baseline set of facts. So, and then there's also just human nature, which is Donald Trump has shown the Democrats that you can just do things, that you can just bulldoze Congress as a branch, that you can get away with a lot more than people thought was possible, particularly if you have as much shamelessness as he does, which is really a superpower, as we write in the book. So there's going to be a great temptation for whoever comes next to use that unilateral power for whatever they deem to be the national interest. And so it's going to require a public demand for some kind of a restoration of balance, and also a political leader who's able to execute that. One of the problems with the last person who tried to do this, Joe Biden, is just he governed substantially to the left of what many people thought they were voting for. But setting that aside, he was also, when you struggle to complete a sentence or a paragraph in a way that's articulate, let alone inspiring, you're not exactly a figurehead to do something as politically difficult as steer the country back in a more centrist or institution-minded direction.
It's a real concern, particularly for Australia. Just looking forward again, the most recent CNN poll in late July showed that 78% of Republicans approve of Trump's performance. Through all the chaos, an economy that's spluttering to say the least, 78% of Republicans still approve of his performance. Do the Democrats have any real hope of cut through here when people are so, as you say, the society is polarized and people's political allegiances are so cemented?
Well, the thing about US elections is, they tend to be pretty close. So yes, he's still pretty popular among Republicans, but he has fallen a little bit. Where he's fallen most substantially among Republicans is in enthusiasm. The enthusiasm, if you look at the same CNN poll, has drained out. I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but it's something like only 18% of Republicans feel very enthusiastic about where things are going with Trump. And so that is meaningful because the question is, well, do they bother to show up and vote? But then there's the whole swing electorate, which is not huge, but it's meaningful. It's decisive. It can decide national elections. And his support has collapsed among independent voters, very, very profoundly. So, I mean, he put together what I would almost describe as a political miracle in 2024. He got out a working class coalition. He performed better than Republicans typically do with black men, with Hispanics. It was a very different coalition. He knitted together all kinds of ideologies. It was a really impressive political performance. And a lot of those new voters who he brought in, young people, African Americans, Hispanics, they have soured on him substantially. So there are sort of two questions. One is, are Democrats capable of capitalizing on that? That is no sure thing. Democrats remain deeply unpopular. They've done very little to improve their popularity. And they're also veering hard to the left, embracing a lot of socialist candidates, making it very easy for Republicans to brand them as socialists and communists and all the other words that they use to describe them. And then the other aspect of that is the structural advantages Republicans have. They have drawn a very favorable map in the House with gerrymandering. The Senate map is very tilted towards Republicans, and they have a financial advantage. So those are the factors in the mix. But if Trump is on this polling trajectory that he is currently now, and he doesn't reverse it, and the war doesn't get resolved, all of those advantages could be washed away by the wave because just the political environment could be so horrible for Republicans.
I'd like to just read some words from the book, some descriptions of Trump. Above all, you write, don't dismiss him as a clown. He has a feral instinct for power. He lies endlessly and preposterously. He authors his own reality, which you mentioned earlier. His complete absence of shame has been his political superpower. You mentioned that earlier as well. Despite all this, despite all the transparent corruption and abuse of power, despite the weakening of the West generally, he has triumphed. Is there anything that he could do that would really turn people off, in your view? Or does it come back to that old line of his that he could shoot somebody in the streets of Manhattan and get away with it?
What I was trying to convey before is he already has turned a lot of people off. It's not true that he has this overall, Teflon base. He has this hardcore base of about 30%, 35%. And yes, for them, Lord knows what it would be that would turn them off. But for the independents, for more traditional Republicans, he's already turned them off. At a minimum, he's made them less enthusiastic. But for that hardcore base, I'm not sure. Because the other thing is they would have to learn about whatever this thing was. I mean, I don't know what the thing would be, but they would have to be tuned into some kind of a media channel that would convey that to them in a way that would seem disappointing to them. And for that really hardcore base, that's a trick. That's a challenging thing to imagine.
Look, I could talk to you for hours about this. It's an amazing book, and my partner went out to buy a copy for a birthday present yesterday, and there's a 5-day waiting list on the book. What's next for Jonathan Swan?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I'm a White House reporter at the New York Times, and this is in my view, the most consequential presidency of my lifetime, and so I'm covering it very aggressively with my reporting partner Maggie Haberman. I don't know down the track. I mean, there are two things I love in journalism personally. I love nonfiction narrative writing, which you do as well, and it's a very strong pull there. I also love long form interviewing on camera and the craft of that and the strategy of that, and it's an electrifying feeling when you do an accountability interview on camera and you've prepared for it and you execute. It's very thrilling, and I think it has a real power that, in a certain way, print has its own power that's durable, but there's something about the power of the screen and the accountability interview that is its own force. So those are sort of the two things that I've been drawn to. But right now, I think this is the most important work I can be doing. So I'm very, very focused on the reporting and the writing.
Jonathan Swan, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
To enjoy more in-depth journalism from the latest edition of Good Weekend, visit us at theage.com.au or smh.com.au. This episode was produced by Conrad Marshall and edited by Tim Mummery, with technical assistance from Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Tammy Mills. Lisa Muxworthy and Tom McKendrick oversee our podcasts, and Melissa Stevens is the editor of Good Weekend. If you enjoyed this episode, follow our podcast and leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. And thanks for listening.